Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hello, and welcome. Thank you so much for coming today to hear this talk, and a big thanks to Kelly and Sean, who've been working on the back end to get everything set up today. I hope you'll enjoy not just the talk, but the reception afterwards, which is going to be right there on the lawn out that way. So I'll remind you all at the end again. My name is Madhavi Colton, and I'm the Executive Director of the Stone Center for Environmental Stewardship here on campus. And I'm actually going to steal a couple of minutes from Meghan to introduce myself and the Stone Center a little bit, because I haven't had a chance to meet many of you so far. So the Stone Center for Environmental Stewardship was recently established here on campus, and our goal is to create positive, long-lasting outcomes for people and the planet by collaboratively solving environmental challenges. And we do that by advancing 3 programmatic areas. We are testing, piloting, trying new ways of connecting academic research with real-world problems in partnership with communities through living labs. And our first living lab is in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and Kristen Barker is here, and she's the research coordinator for the Beyond Yellowstone Living Lab. And we're in the process of talking about what a living lab here in Northern California could look like. That would probably involve a lot of people in this room thinking collaboratively about how to address environmental challenges here with communities. That's one. Our second programmatic area is we bring people together we collaborate, convene people around big, thorny questions that we face in conservation. And the third area is that we teach and learn from the campus community and beyond to better prepare current and future generations of conservation leaders. So that's a little bit about the Stone Center. As for me, I guess I'm a recovering marine ecologist at this point. I have a PhD in marine ecology from the University of Melbourne in Australia. I've worked on marine protected areas here in California. I spent a decade on international coral reef conservation. And most recently was the Vice President and Executive Director of Audubon, California, which is my mental cue to introduce our speaker today, Meghan Hertel. Meghan is the, I'm going to get this right, Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity, and Habitat, thank you, Justin, at the California Natural Resources Agency. At CNRA, Meghan oversees efforts like the state's 30 by 30 work, the removing green tape initiative, and other large-scale habitat conservation work. And prior to CNRA, Meghan also worked at Audubon here in California and was the director of the Working Lands program, so working with communities across the Central Valley to figure out how we can protect habitat for birds and people. So with that, welcome, Meghan, and thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for having me here. I don't get to go to college campuses very often anymore, and it's always so inspiring to be back in this environment. And I was reflecting of when I did my graduate degree back on the East Coast. I went to Clark University and I studied environmental science and policy, and we were taught 2 things: how the United States was doing it and how California was doing it. And I'm not joking, like this was literally a class. They were like, here's everyone else and here's California. And California was being held up as this incredible bar that was pushing conservation, taking care of people, plants, animals, and landscapes, and really setting the pace for the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And then when I moved out here and I took my first job here, I was in a room full of people, and they were sitting there and they were upset and angry about how slow California was moving and how we weren't innovating enough and we weren't investing enough and not doing enough science. And that's when I realized the reason California is on the cutting edge is because that's how you feel when you're in these rooms. That all of you are pushing to do more and think creatively and think innovatively about how we protect the place that is our planet. So just a big thank you, and also congratulations for picking a college in the right part of the country where you are the ones doing that creative thinking. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Like you said, I lead the state's 30 by 30 effort. I also work on cutting the green tape, which is an effort to streamline environmental permitting to increase the pace and scale of restoration, and all things biodiversity. So I greatly appreciated having lunch downstairs in that weird room with all the taxidermy. I didn't get a chance to look at all of them, but there's some really incredible specimens down there. So all of you know this, California is one of the globe's 36 biodiversity hotspots. We have more endemic species than anywhere in the country, but we are also losing those species, right? We are losing ground to climate change driven extreme events, to invasive species, to human development moving into areas. Do you know that 1 in 8 Americans lives in California? And that is actually growing. Not that you would hear that on some news sources, but our population is growing. And the other threat we're thinking a lot about right now is the federal government. Federal government owns and operates roughly 50% of the land in California, 50 million acres, right? And so if they are not fully staffed and fully funded, what does that mean for the biodiversity and the landscapes that have made California important and special that it is today? 30 by 30, how many of you know what it is? Patrick, do not raise your hand. You're already intimidated that you're an expert. Oh, well, that's not everyone, okay. So I'm sure you've seen the news about the fact that we're in a catastrophic biodiversity loss worldwide. It has been in the news for many years. Several years ago, I would say what, Patrick, 8 years? 9, 10 years ago, there started to be a call in the scientific community that we needed to take action. How many years ago would you say that started?
For biodiversity conservation?
Yeah, for the 30 by 30.
Very seriously around 2016.
2016. So it became this international call from scientists, right? This is where it started, that they were doing these studies, they were seeing this catastrophic biodiversity loss, and they're like, governments and people, we need to do something. And this is where the 30 by 30 movement came from. And the goal is to conserve 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030 to slow and stop biodiversity loss. Is it enough? Probably not. Is it a good metric that everyone can get behind, can track, can see progress? Absolutely. So here in California, Governor Newsom in 2020 issued an executive order making 30 by 30 a target for California. Really proud to say we were the first state in the United States to issue a 30 by 30 objective. The United States followed shortly after us with the America the Beautiful goal. Unfortunately, that America the Beautiful Act has been rolled back under this administration, but California's 30 by 30 commitment continues. Not just because it's an executive order and he's my boss and I do what he tells me to, but also because it's now state law. So 2 years after the executive order was issued, we actually had a state law that was passed that made 30 by 30 part of our objectives. And it's not just here in California. So this is one of the things that gives me hope about 30 by 30. This past year, I was able to go to Colombia, where over 190 countries who have similar commitments to conserving 30% of land and water, where they're talking about how do we achieve this. This is the global biodiversity framework. Those countries are holding steady on their commitments. And one of our goals this year is to start recruiting more states and other subnationals, so provinces, states, to be able to join the 30 by 30 movement in the absence of federal leadership in the United States on this. This is something Patrick participated in. So when the executive order was passed, we went through a public process. Lucy, we were talking earlier about how the state always wants to do public process, get input from the best scientists, community members on how to achieve things. 18 months we spent doing public stakeholder engagement in 2020 is when we started that. So this was no easy task. All of this was done during the pandemic. We did over 70 tribal consultations. We had regional meetings. We had expert advisory groups. Thousands of letters were submitted. And these aren't like 1-page letters. I mean, people submitted like 10-page letters on how to do this work. And the outcome is we have this strategy document. It's called the 30 by 30 Pathways document. I would encourage everyone to take a look at it. It is online. It sets out our path to getting to conserving 30% in California. So one of the first questions people ask me when we talk about 30 by 30 is, well, how do you know what counts? What's the definition? We were talking earlier about the importance of having strong definitions for things. Well, 2 things were clear from our public engagement process. One, the land needs to be durably protected. So that means it needs to have some sort of conservation easement, some sort of legal assurance that it will not be then developed into a Walmart or a housing development. And it needs to be managed for biodiversity. Now, this doesn't mean you can't have cattle on there, but it means you need to be thinking about running your cattle for a way that benefits biodiversity. Doesn't mean you can't have access of people. You can have trails, but you also need to be managing that habitat with the goal of conserving biodiversity. So we put together 3 core objectives as part of this. The first is I love the desert tortoise, one of my favorite species that I have never seen in person. Has anyone here seen one in person? Not in a zoo. Oh, is that a wavering hand? Is that a yes or no? Okay. All right, 2, 3 people. Sean, nice. I like that. So our first core objective is obviously conserve biodiversity, right? That's what 30 by 30 is for. The second is increase our equitable access. We know that getting people outside is so important for their health, their mental well-being, and it creates more folks like you. People that want to spend their lives conserving and stewarding and taking care of nature that takes care of us. And our third objective is to address climate change. And that's because we know the threat of biodiversity loss and the threat of climate change are woven together, right? You can't address one without the other. We also have 10 strategies that get us there, everything from acquisitions and easements to building local capacity to engaging with our scientific community to understand how to do this better. And we have committed to do it in a way that thinks about equity, diversity, inclusion, even when those words are not great to say in certain circumstances. We are not wavering from that at all. The other one is we want to do this in a way that lifts up tribal partnerships. This was one of our core commitments in there. And the third is that we still have an economy that is strong and growing in California. And that's an important one, that we figure out a way to be able to conserve biodiversity, meet our climate objectives, and still have a strong economy here. This is where we started, but before I go on that, I just want to give one shout out. There's a couple members here of the California Biodiversity Network. You can raise your hand. Oh, wow, more than a few. So the California Biodiversity Network helped create an appendix to that pathways document I showed you earlier that outlined all of the science we thought we would need and we should look into to better be able to understand how to reach 30 by 30. David, do you want to give a description at all of that appendix? This is what you get for sitting in the back row.
I've never had so many people work so hard to write appendix.
I mean, it's a meaty appendix. And CBN continues to advise us at the state and the broader 30 by 30 movement, doing ongoing science informing working groups to help us get to that 30%. So thank you for your past and ongoing work, everybody that's in that. So here's where we started. When we published our first annual report, we were at roughly 24% of lands and 16% of coastal waters conserved. Here's where we were as of September of last year. September 2024, we added roughly 861,000 acres on the land side. Coastal waters is still at 16.2%, and we'll talk about that in a second. But that land addition included some things. It included new acquisitions and easements. It included increased and improved protections on lands, and it included data improvements. And so I'll come back to that later, but we don't have perfect data on where there are conserved areas in California. And I know that's a little bit crazy to think about, but we're still trying to make sure we've got the best data possible on this. So a couple of the wins I wanted to highlight in this past year. Last year, the state of California granted roughly $100 million to tribal partners for the first ever ancestral land return in California. We're really proud of this. This went to 23 different projects, both to buy back land and also do stewardship, monitoring, science. Roughly 40,000 acres are going back to their original stewards. This is a picture of the Hoopa tribe. This is Hoopa Mountain, 10,000 acres of their ancestral land. You might notice that it's looking pretty degraded. This is land that had, I think, both a fire and was also logged. It had then been planted back for a carbon project, but the Hoopa tribe is taking it over and will steward that one going forward. So really rewarding and exciting to see those. The other big one is we had national monument designations. Doesn't this feel like a really long time ago, by the way? Wasn't that long ago. President Biden expanded 2 national monuments in California and created 2 new national monuments. Anyone know the national monument expansion closest to here? Well done, Berryessa. I like that you're like trying to hold your mouth shut in the front seat over here. Berryessa Snow Mountain had an expansion there. San Gabriel National Monument down in LA. And then 2 that I think are just so stunning to look at. This is Chuckwalla National Monument. This is by Joshua Tree. This is incredible. A coalition of over 7 tribes came together to lead this national monument designation. It has its ancestral important lands, amazing trails through this, also endemic species like the Chuckwalla lizard, and an important recreation space. And the other one that Biden designated in his last days is Satitla, which is up in Northern California. The water that comes from these high elevation lakes filters into the Sacramento River, which means almost 2/3 of California in some way benefits from it. So these are areas that equal almost 1 million acres. These are also areas that we expect this current administration to try to decrease and or roll back, which is really unfortunate because these are incredible landscapes and very, very important to our tribal partners. One of the other big accomplishments we had was from our Ocean Protection Council. So you may have noticed the ocean side didn't change between our two reports. It stayed at 16.2%. And that's because our coastal waters are publicly owned. They're under the public trust. So there's not a bunch of different land ownership types. So the decision on what counts and how to improve biodiversity management from the coastal side is going to come from the top down. So right now, all of our marine protected areas, which some folks in this room worked on, count for 30 by 30. But that's it. And so our Ocean Protection Council released a decision-making framework for public comment to ask people what else should count. How do we improve biodiversity protection in the coast? How do we think about the integration of land and water? And so they're going through all of those comments now, and we'll have a new framework in the coming months. This is a shameless plug for you to track government processes, because when we put out these requests, we'd love to hear from scientists and from the public to understand, how do we do this better, right? How do we set up these mechanisms and these policies to have real outcomes? What do we have left to do? This is not a small task. 4.8 million acres on the land, 500,000 acres in coastal waters is what we have left to achieve in the next 5 years. This is something we report up to the governor's office on a quarterly basis. This is a large amount of land, but we feel like we can get there, but it is very much a big tent movement that needs everybody's help. And this is my shameless sea otter photo before I ask you and tell you like what we're thinking about and where we could use help. So the first one is, one of the big pieces that we want to make sure is, and when we hit 2030, is we don't have a bunch of postage stamps of conserved areas, right? Like a piece over here and a piece over here. We want to make sure that it's connected, that there's connectivity both in elevation and across the landscape. Mountain lion picture, just I feel like that really resonates with being able to get species across the landscape. And so we're working with CBN and others to think about, okay, how connected is what we already have conserved and where are those gaps? The other really big piece about connectivity, everyone loves to talk about wildlife crossings, which are incredibly amazing and inspiring. But if you haven't conserved the land on either side of those wildlife crossings, they don't work very well. So the Wallace-Annenberg crossing, is everyone familiar with that one? It's down in LA. Few nods, if you not, it's an amazingly large, it's one of our largest land bridge crossings that will go in California. It's under construction now. Dirt just moved on it. It will be for mountain lions. P22, which was this incredibly charismatic and personified mountain lion, was killed, unfortunately, was hit by a car and then ultimately euthanized. But he became the poster child and helped drive crossings like this forward. So thinking about how do we better measure, map, and advance connectivity across a landscape is an area where we could use more support. The second one is in policy. This is actually a picture of the Snow Mountain Berryessa monument expansion. So we had a great conversation over lunch about how academics and science is so important to policy and how to be able to translate the work that you do that shows that places are important and need protection to the people making decisions. You are a trusted voice when you talk with elected officials. And so the more that we can work together to be able to carry messages of why this matters to everyday people is so, so important. Anyone know this species? You got that one? Very nice. Blunt-nosed leopard lizard. That was very quiet. Blunt-nosed leopard lizard. This is a lizard that is found in the Central Valley. It's endemic here. It is endangered. This is actually part of a breed and release program with the Fresno Zoo that is helping maintain the species at this point. It's also a species that requires mitigation when people develop on its habitat. So one of the areas that we could use support is thinking about how to unlock private sector funding like mitigation and where that should go on the landscape, both to help species, but advance a landscape scale conservation effort. Because species like this are incredible. There is going to be impacted by things like high-speed rail, housing, road development, and we want to make sure we're doing the best mitigation as possible so we have these in future generations. This I'm incredibly excited about. The more we can think about and advance tribal partnerships, the better we will be at achieving 30 by 30 and having a resilient California. So this is a bill that passed last year to make cultural burning easier and to give tribes the authority to do that work. So this is actually a picture of the Karuk tribe. So little shout out. I promise I didn't put that in after our lunch today. We know that removing people from the landscape and removing the management that tribes done has done very big harm to our forests. And so we now need to change the policies that we, as the state of California, put in place that prevented the cultural stewardship of these lands. The state has recognized our error. We are trying to fix the policies that make it hard to do this work. But we need to get more of these practices out on the landscape. And the last one I wanted to talk about is centering people. We often will say we have 4.8 million more acres to go, or we've conserved lots of wetland habitat. We as the government are not always great at talking about why that matters to people. And so my ask of you here is to think about when you do your science and research, that you also think about how to communicate why that matters to people. One of the reasons we're seeing so much government layoff and downsizing and the loss of funding is not everyone understands what government employees do. And not everyone understands why the work on conservation is important, because they're worried about putting food on the table. They're worried about how long it's going to take them to get to work, price of gas. Are they going to have clean air, clean water? Conservation, environmental protection contributes to quality of life of people, but we haven't always made that connection. And we haven't always been good about communicating to the general public why we work on the things and why they should care about it. So I would ask that as you go about your research and your work, you really think about that extra step of communication and centering communities and people in it to the extent possible. All right, earlier I mentioned data. So we have a commitment to data transparency with 30 by 30. This is our CA Nature website where we have online, you can go and explore what currently counts for 30 by 30, who owns it, whether it's publicly accessible or not. All of the data is online and available for download. And so I have been asking every time I talk to people to please go and look at this website. If you have lands in your area that you think should be counting for this, let us know. If you see things where you're like, whoa, that definitely should not be counting, please let us know. We want to make sure we get it right. We need to have the right data, not only because it adds or subtracts from the amount we've conserved, but because we want to make sure those areas are connected. We want to make sure that we've conserved the diversity of habitat types and biodiversity that make California special. And if we don't know what is currently conserved and protected, we as a state can't try to enforce that, right? And make sure that it continues to be protected. I did also want to mention that you can even zoom down into your community. I'm sorry, I didn't pull up Berkeley on this one. I went with Sacramento. Also, my husband works for the city of Sacramento, and Sacramento's lands aren't currently captured accurately. So just to tell you the challenge of data improvements on this. You can also go in and we map by habitat type. There's an option to look at Access Explorer. So lots to do there. So I think I wanted to just take a moment here and say, we talk a lot about habitat loss and climate change and federal government decreases, and that's a lot, right? It can be really depressing. I'm sure in the studies many of you do, it feels like we're losing ground and that you're working on really hard issues. But there is so much reason for hope. I see 30 by 30 as an excellent reason for hope. It's a framework to lift up important science, to lift up important conservation happening on the ground. Voters in November here in California passed a $10 billion climate bond. Much of that money will go out onto the ground to do land conservation, restoration, pieces like that. We still need to figure out how to better fund research and science and those engaged in helping move that forward. So things you can do, please take a scan of this. We issue a monthly newsletter that has all kinds of things like webinars that are coming up to talk about specific species, events in different parts of the state that you can go to. Similarly, if you have things you would like us to promote through our listserv, please send them. You have a new science study that's coming out that relates to 30 by 30 and you'd like us to highlight a blurb and link to it, would love to do that, right? If you've got events, please let us know. We also have an annual summit that happens every year where we get together 300 or 400 folks who are working on 30 by 30 to really connect and talk about what we need to do to drive this work forward. And then follow us online. I will admit, none of us are like amazing Instagram or Twitter people, but we have interns who are slightly better than me. So please do consider following us on LinkedIn or Instagram. We're working to grow our communication through those channels because it just reaches a different set of people than our newsletters. So take a moment and join us. And then we do have some information about how you can do 30 by 30 in your backyard. This is an area where we really need to do a lot more work. And we're actually talking with the Stone Center on how we could have broader conversations about urban biodiversity and allow urban centers to understand their role and see how they can participate in 30 by 30. This one is the Data Explorer. Sorry for sticking that at the end, but if you do want to go online and look at CA Nature to see what counts and what doesn't count, this is the QR code for that. And then I will finally wrap up. I hope I saved enough time for some questions. Great, I did. I tried to move quickly through that because there's a lot of smart folks in this room. And I'd love to hear what you're thinking about. If you have questions on 30 by 30 or broader state policies, happy to try to answer them or just hear what you're working on. With that, I'll stop. Who's gonna be the brave first person?
So you have this picture of these kids outside in nature, and this resonates with me. I've worked at outdoor schools and environmental education camps for a lot of my time prior to my PhD. In Washington, they recently started a program where I don't know if this is gonna stay around, probably will, where they're giving schools funding to send every 5th and 6th grader to outdoor school in the state. Do you know if California's doing a comparable initiative?
We do. We have a 4th grade program. So every 4th grade student and their family can go and register, I believe, for a state pass. I'm looking at the one other state person for verification on this. And then we also have a thing called library passes. So there are libraries across the state where anyone can go and check out a state parks pass and go see state parks for free. But 4th grade, we have a similar thing for 4th grade. It is really important, but always under threat of budget cuts, for sure. Other thoughts, all the way in the back.
Have you considered using story maps to communicate this initiative and the kind of work you're doing? Because I see on the website, we have like a lot of webinars, but not everyone has the kind of time or just.
So true.
And especially since your work has so much like opportunity to engage the community and have call to action. And you have a lot of photos in your presentation, so I feel like a lot of the information is kind of right now just stuck in the room, but with a story map, it could be a great way to include your outreach efforts.
So to repeat the question for any folks that are online, the question was, do we have a story map? We do a lot of webinars, but not everybody can participate in webinars, particularly because our webinars are during working hours. And a story map with pictures could be a good way to tell it. Yes, we do have a story map. It's several years old at this point. It's embedded in our website. I think we could do much more. We've been talking about, could we do like a faces and projects of 30 by 30 story map where you could sort of zoom through various places in California and hear from people who have done 30 by 30 work or complementary conservation efforts. So would love to follow up and do that. I think it's a great suggestion.
Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. It's always really cool to hear updates. It's like a not insignificant task, of course, to classify what lands count and what don't. But I think one of the major criticisms of 30 by 30 is like, okay, well, when are you gonna add new lands? Like, when are you gonna actively like try to increase this number by brute force rather than just by changing the classification schema?
Yeah.
So I guess, can you share, if anything, like what is the state doing? What might they be planning? Any initiatives on that front to actively increase our land counts?
Yeah, absolutely. So as of the last 3 years, we had what was called the Nature-Based Solutions Grant Package. So roughly $1.3 billion was invested by the state of California in nature-based solutions. So that is both 30 by 30, but also things that are contributing to our climate objectives and our outdoors for all objectives. A very good chunk of that went to new acquisitions and easements. Those take time to close though, and so the state will come in with a portion of that. We may grant that money 1 year and it could take 2 years or more for that acquisition to close. We don't count it until it does actually close. The other thing we are trying to do is increase our state parks land. For many years, state parks have kind of been very static, and that was a lack of funding to manage those, a lack of money to buy new parks. Dos Rios State Park opened this past year. It's the first new state park in 10 years in California. It's in the San Joaquin Valley, so a park poor and limited space. We are hoping to see more of that in the next 2 years. Open outdoor access is a priority for the governor and first partner. And so it's something they'll be thinking a lot about, and we're hoping to see some more park cutting there. But you're right, it is slow to add these lands, but we are trying to make this not an accounting exercise. I should say, even if we get all the data right, we only think it'll probably be about 1 million more acres. I know that sounds like a lot. That's only 1% of the overall. So the rest of it is going to have to be gained either by improved management or by actually acquisitions and easements, so improving the durability. The other piece we've been working on is with the federal government to try to improve management and protection. Obviously, that is probably off the table for the next 4 years. And so now we're starting to think about, can we work with counties, water districts, others who own land that maybe could improve management for biodiversity or could put conservation easements on those properties so they're durably protected. Like LADWP owns and operates 300,000 acres in the Eastern Sierra around their reservoirs. So we're going to talk to them to say, is this protected? Are you actually targeting the species that are on this land? So a lot more work is needed in that area. Ooh, I don't know who went up first. We'll start from the left side and then we'll move right.
Great talk, thank you. What do you think is the role of working lands like agroforestry or like sustainable agriculture and rangelands? And how it fits into this, both as a retiring like farmland and then conserving areas that are like farm sustainable?
To repeat for folks on the line, the question is, what is the role of working lands, both from the perspective of retiring agricultural lands and working those landscapes in a sustainable fashion that can contribute to 30 by 30? So full disclosure, when I was at Audubon, I ran the working lands program. So I have a very soft spot for working landscapes. I spent a lot of time with ranchers and with farmers in the San Joaquin and Sacramento Valley. Agriculture has an incredibly important role to play in 30 by 30 and our other state priorities. I do want to point out, we do have a natural and working lands climate smart strategy. Never make short titles for our policies in the state. And we have a nature-based solutions target policy as well. And both of those have specific actions just for our productive lands. But there's a Venn diagram where some of those overlap with 30 by 30. We know that we need to have management on land. So particularly cattle ranching, rice, there are certain types of agriculture that fit very well with biodiversity protection and uplift. Those would count for 30 by 30 if they have permanent easements or protection on them. There's also a whole strategy in our document that just acknowledges the fact that 30% is not enough. And in the face of climate change, we don't necessarily want to lock up every single piece of land in place, right? There needs to be some flexibility for dynamic habitat movement as we see conditions change going forward. And some of these working landscapes provide excellent opportunities for that, right? Where maybe they're not permanently conserved, but they're providing habitat now and they're really important. And we want to make sure we give them recognition and keep them on the landscape.
So I was curious, the land acquisition side of things, what role do like nonprofit land trusts play? And I was also curious, like in the Bay Area, where there's like a lot more financial resources, there'll be more land trusts with greater amounts of funding. But in other places in California, there might not be as much funding or as much organizations there. So how do we like make sure that enough land is being conserved in all parts of the state?
So the question was, what role do NGOs and land trusts play? And how do you balance when you have some sections of the state that have greater financial resources and perhaps capacity in their land trust versus other areas of the state that have gaps in that? So I just spent, earlier this week, I was at the California Council of Land Trust Conference in Yosemite. I was in snow yesterday, a foot of snow. So it's really strange to now be here in 70-degree weather. There is an amazing network of land trusts across the state, and they are very much delivering on 30 by 30. Like they're the core NGOs that are out acquiring easements and acquisitions. There are gaps in spaces. So one of our goals is to map where we have conserved lands and look where those holes are and then decide, are those holes there because there's not capacity in a land trace chest? And could the state step in with funding to work in areas of the state that perhaps don't have very many acquisitions or easements? There are some land trusts that cover very big areas like Trust for Public Land. They're not a traditional land trust in that they don't hold the land forever, but they do land trust work. So there are some groups that could move in or help support the establishment of a local one. Also, the Bay Area is incredible because their funders here often invest in other parts of the state. And part of the trick there is us being able to tell the story to people who want to give money about why other areas are also important to conserve. It's very important to know the biodiversity in places in your backyard, but also we have places that are much further away and harder to see that have incredible wildlife, people working on the lands that need help to be able to manage that biodiversity. It's a great question. It's a really great question. The state last year to Department of Conservation and Wildlife Conservation Board gave capacity grants to CCLT, Council of Land Trust, and they then granted it out to a bunch of their organizations to build their capacity across the state. Yeah.
Yes, this is pretty similar to the questions about like private lands, but I kind of struggled with the idea that the idea is kind of baked into 30 by 30 and have heard that like it's either protected or it's not.
Yeah.
And if it's not protected, it's not ecologically valuable. And like, obviously, like you guys have put so much thought into the definition of what should be considered and it's not, but my question is like, in the long term, like, what is the risk that we're like furthering this idea of this binary to the public?
Yeah,
And I'm wondering, like, thinking broadly about like communicating this idea to the general public, like, how do we tell the public like that there's so much more to this
Yeah.
than like 30 by 30, like the numbers?
absolutely. So for folks online, the question was the complementary lands that are not necessarily either durably conserved or focused on biodiversity have an incredibly important role to play in overall health of our ecosystems and our communities. And is there a risk by saying what's in and what's out that you are disregarding and devaluing that area that maybe doesn't have an easement on it, right? Or isn't first managed for biodiversity, but is still providing really important habitat? And that is a completely fair point and criticism. We do have a strategy in the Pathways document that totally talks about land that is complementary, that isn't durably or isn't managed for biodiversity, but we need to do more to lift that up. Early in my time in this position, I went to this meeting full of farmers, and I have worked with farmers for most of my career, and they were so incredibly angry because they didn't count. And I spent the whole time trying to explain to them, like, just because you're not a green dot on this map does not make what you do not critically important. I was also really thrilled to be in a room where farmers wanted to count for 30 by 30 because they are part of the solution. In many other parts of the country, that was not the conversation that was had around 30 by 30. A lot of working lands felt like it was going to be a land grab versus a very much voluntary effort, which ours is. The other thing I would say is we have specific state strategies that are just focused on working lands that lift up the value and importance of working lands without the easement mechanism on it. You just lucked out and got the 30 by 30 person, not the working lands, but we always need to do more on that. And I think it's really important to call that out, right? Like we want 30 by 30 to be a motivating tool, not an exclusionary tool. It's a really good comment.
Is there any coordination with other states in terms of accounting methods, definitions,
Yeah.
strategies, best practices?
So repeating the question, any coordination with other states in terms of metrics, accounting, best practices? Yes, and we'd like to do more of it. So California co-leads the High Ambition Coalition Subnational Task Force as part of the Global Biodiversity Framework. I had to practice that like 18 times to be able to get that out, and also the coffee helps. So we co-lead that with Quebec, and it is a working group of subnationals that includes some states, surprisingly more subnationals than states at this point. And we meet regularly and share lessons learned. We're like, how are you defining it? How are you mapping it? Canada has a very similar definition in mapping as we do, which was really interesting to learn and is struggling with some of the same challenges. So there's a really good working group there. We are starting to try to recruit other states to join the High Ambition Coalition and looking at whether or not we can have a state working group. Under the last federal administration, when we pulled out of the climate accord, the U.S. Climate Alliance was established, which is a nonprofit group that coordinates all the states still committed to achieving climate objectives. We'd love to see something similar from a biodiversity perspective. So far, we have a handful of states. Today, Vermont just joined, which is super exciting. And we are learning from them. So like Massachusetts doesn't have their 30 by 30 commitment done yet. They are doing their plan right now. And we have regular calls where they're like, well, what did you do about this? And we'll be like, well, you should really consider complementary conservation better than we have, right? Like you need to be able to represent all these other measures in your work. So we are doing it, but there's more space for it, for sure.
Well, thanks a lot, Megan, for overview of 30 by 30. I want to ask you about the use of science for decision making in the 30 by 30 program. And you know, as you know, a lot of research has been published on important aspects spatially of biodiversity and climate change in California, connectivity, individual species, wildfire, colleagues and I published the distribution of carbon, an important ecosystem service. How is, and of course, the CPN is, your advisor. How have you used you and the secretary used actually the scientific information
Mhm.
in implementing 30 by 30? Or is it more kind of opportunistic and, and then looking forward, like, of all the things in David's appendix, like, what are the most important science needs to make your policy decisions?
So the question was, how does science integrate with how we have made decisions on the past and how we are making decisions going forward? And what is my wish list of science? So the science very much went into the initial creation of the Pathways Plan, and we've been pushing on that going forward. One of the things we heard loud and clear from stakeholders in the public is they did not want the state to do a prioritization. They did not want the state to look at all the landscape in California and say, great, we're going to conserve redwood forest over desert ecosystem. Or Northeast California is more important than San Diego. There was a real pushback against that. You may remember it from some of the conversations. So we have left it as a very big open tent, but tried to provide that information through CA Nature so that those who are out on the landscape doing land acquisition and easements can look at that information and be able to inform their decisions. We've set up the policy, we allocate money into grant programs that people can apply to, but it's very much land trust and NGOs out there doing the actual acquisitions. And so our goal has been to provide them with the science and resources so they can take that into consideration. We also provide it to our funding agencies as they look at their grant guidelines to be able to say, can you prioritize some of these that are providing climate benefits, that are providing access benefits? So those are two ways. I would also say my wish list is I'd love to be able to better understand connectivity across the landscape. Our Department of Fish and Wildlife has done amazing research on this. We have an incredible data set called the ACE data set, but there are many other data sets and studies out there on connectivity, and would love to be able to think about how is that working in relation to the conserved areas. The other one that I think is a big gap for us is right now we measure habitat type. So we can say, all right, we've conserved 32% of the remaining wetlands that are on the landscape. Two issues with that. It's what's already on the landscape, not what is actually needed from an ecological standpoint. We've lost 90 to 95% of our wetlands. So if we're conserving 30% of what's left, that's a fraction of what we had historically. So being able to better set goals based on what we need from species and ecological function versus just on habitat type. So that's one weakness. The other one is measuring how the biodiversity is doing on the ground. So we track the areas that are conserved. We do not have the capacity to go out and monitor all these lands, nor do I think the state should spend public money to go out and monitor 25 million acres to understand the health of biodiversity. But it would be good to understand, like, are these lands really providing the most biodiversity that they can in ecological function? So we're trying to wrap our hands around how do we get to that. There's some cool things happening on remote sensing, but there's not really one agreed upon method on how to measure biodiversity, right? That's like easy and simple to do. Some people are like, you do eDNA. Other people are like, you do a square on the ground and you count the biodiversity. There doesn't seem to be a consensus that is effective and affordable, which is something the state would need to do. So that's another research area. And then I will just give another shout out to CBN. They just took all the data off CA Nature and did a little bit of that connectivity analysis and started looking at which species groups are well represented and which ones are not in the habitat distribution. They should be coming out with a white paper publication on that shortly, and we will certainly be promoting that. And that is great because it's an independent body drawing the circles on the map, right, where the gaps are versus the state coming in and drawing those circles. Yeah, I have so many research questions. I could keep going.
I would love to hear a little bit about the Green Tape initiative and how
Sure.
that has impacted 30 by 30 and maybe something that would make us excited and are ready to hear about, to think about.
So the question was, hear a little bit about cutting the green tape and to try to make it exciting. That was the takeaway from that question. I'm just teasing. Permitting is not everyone's excitement. I think it's fascinating. So cutting the green tape is a brand about an effort to work across agencies to try to speed up the process of getting a permit. There was a time when you would try to go do a wetland restoration, it would take you as long and be as expensive as it was to build housing or to build Walmart, right? Like it was the same permitting mechanism. same cost, you had to do all the same studies. Cutting the green tape is a recognition that if we want to meet the needs for habitat management and restoration, we have to do it faster and more effectively. So we've been working with a group of stakeholders over the last 5 years to identify a list of like, what are the changes that can be made? It's probably not surprising to know that the changes range from fixing your statute, fixing the laws that guide our permitting, to the really hard change of culture change. Right? And so it's that whole swath. We've made some really great changes in statute that have created a bunch of different tools and techniques that people can use that have gotten down processes to things like 45 days and no cost to actually permit. We are not all the way there. And now we're working on that culture change, both within our own regulatory entities, but also in project practitioners. Because if restorationists don't know to ask for these streamlined tools, we don't always know to suggest them. A big worry on this is we have what's like working relationships with our federal partners to streamline things through consistency determinations, where you get a federal permit, we review it and we're like, great, you've checked the boxes. There's a real question on who's going to be on that federal side and whether or not our federal regulations are going to be strong enough for us as a state of California to continue to say, okay, you've gotten your federal permit. So I think there's going to be some introspection in the next few years, depending on what happens on the federal side. And there is still more to do. Like we have cases where mitigation has to mitigate for itself. Wrap your head around that. Like you're doing a mitigation project that then requires you to mitigate. Like things like that are why people sometimes are like, what is government doing? So trying to work through some of those where we uphold the good reason we have these permits, which is to protect the landscape. It's why we have clean water. It's why we have some of these species left, but not let it get in the way of making sure we have these species going forward. Did I make it exciting?
Yeah.
Okay, because I can throw out some section codes if you want. Right behind it. Okay, this is the last question, so no pressure.
But there's gonna be them removing outside, so many more.
Oh, and I'm sorry, I missed the one online. Are there capacity grants being, I'll come back to you. I'm doing two.
That's fine.
Issued to tribes. Yes, so the Nature-Based Solutions Tribal Grant Program, we had that last year. That was that $100 million that went out to ancestral land and then also did restoration and management. There is more money in this bond for that program. There will be limited amount of it to go to pure capacity because of bond law, but some of that will be able to go to project management and working with tribes, which is great. Okay, in the back.
You alluded a couple of times to limitations in data tracking for 30x30. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about methodologies that you're
Sure.
using. I mean, what's missing and how do you speak to that for it?
Great. The question was dive a little deeper on the data limitations. Also, I love that the permitting and the data question were like right behind each other right there. So right now we use two publicly accessible data sets to inform 30x30, the California Conservation Easement Database and the California Protected Area Database, CCED and CPAD, more commonly referred to. And associated with those are what's called gap codes that are created by USGS. And the gap code identifies level of protection, level of disturbance, and activity on the land. Like gap code 1 and 2 counts for 30x30, gap code 3 and 4 does not. To the earlier comment, there are so many lands that are like gap code 2.3 and gap code 2.4. So ultimately what we have asked is we work with the land manager and we try to provide case examples where land managers have chosen one gap code or another. And then the land manager themselves decides where they fall in that. And then we work with Green Info Network to update it. It is a pretty massive task just because some of these parcels are small, some of them are quite big. Ownership history can be really complex and even getting the word out to people to correct their data is really important, which is why I include it in every talk, even when I don't know if any of you own 10,000 acres, but if you do, please go check it. I'm hoping that AI at some point or other big data solutions could come in and help us. The last thing I'll say about it is both of these data sets, and this was important to us, are not 30x30 data sets. They're public data sets that inform quite a bit of different research. We didn't want to have something that was separate where we were keeping it all on its own. So when people update CPAD and CCED, it can go into future research efforts to inform ongoing science and other studies. If you have ideas on how to effectively, besides like calling all 58 counties, which we did last year, would love to talk about it. Okay, I think that was the last question.
Yes.
Thank you all so much for your time.